The sun was already setting, painting the sky a sickly orange that seemed to foreshadow disaster. Pedro watched the horizon of the old farm, a shiver running down his spine. It wasn't the approaching night's chill, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong with that land. He'd bought the property from the Fernandez for a steal, ignoring the pitying glances and whispers about the curse that hung over the place. The first few days were filled with hard work and hope. The land, though parched, promised much. But soon, that promise dissolved into a nightmare. Seeds refused to sprout, the cattle grew thin for no apparent reason, and at night, a distant lament echoed through the fields. It wasn't the wind, nor the cry of an animal. It was a scream, guttural, coming from beneath the earth, a scream that seemed laden with an ancient sorrow. Pedro tried everything. He called agronomists, veterinarians, even a priest. No one found an explanation. The priest, an old man with tired eyes, merely mumbled about restless spirits and advised Pedro to leave. But Pedro was stubborn, and his life's investment was there. Nights became the worst torment. The scream grew louder, more desperate, and Pedro began to have visions. Shapeless shadows crept in the corners of the house, and a sweet, sickly smell of disturbed earth and old blood hung in the air. One night, he woke up in a cold sweat, convinced the scream was coming from the cornfield. Armed with a flashlight, he walked out there. The heavy air seemed to suck the oxygen from his lungs. The rows of dry corn stood like skeletal fingers, scratching the dark sky. The scream was now almost a hoarse whisper, a macabre invitation. Suddenly, a shiver ran through Pedro. The earth beneath his feet was no longer firm. He felt it pulse, alive like a giant, diseased heart. In one specific spot in the cornfield, the earth seemed to sink. The flashlight revealed a mound of fresh soil, recently disturbed. With trembling hands, he began to dig. With each shovel of dirt, the smell of death intensified. And then he saw it. Not a body, but something far worse. Thick, twisted roots sprouted from the ground, intertwining into shapes that vaguely imitated human figures, like bodies contorting in agony. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of these roots, and from each one, a thin red trickle oozed, as if the very earth was bleeding. The scream now was deafening, coming from all directions, from each of those roots that seemed to breathe. It wasn't the lament of a spirit, but the agony of the earth itself, which for centuries had swallowed lives, and now writhed in pain, spewing back the misery it had absorbed. Pedro dropped the shovel and recoiled, terror paralyzing him. The roots moved, slowly twisting, as if trying to reach him. He realized that the scream was not a warning, but a curse. He hadn't bought a farm, but a living grave, a piece of hell on earth. Pedro was never the same again. He fled the farm that very night without looking back. But even miles away, he could still hear the cry of the cursed earth, an eternal lament that would haunt him for the rest of his days, reminding him of the horror the earth could hold within. The curse of the Fernandez farm was not recent, nor was it a natural phenomenon. Its roots were deep, as intertwined as the twisted roots Pedro had unearthed. Centuries ago, that fertile land was home to an ancient indigenous tribe, the Kaiowás. They lived in harmony with nature, respecting the cycles of the earth and its spirits. Peace was shattered with the arrival of the Bandeirantes. Thirsty for gold and slaves, they massacred the tribe, desecrating their sacred sites and spilling innocent blood. The tribe's shaman, in his last breaths, cast a terrible curse upon the land. He cursed greed, promising that everything planted there for profit would rot, and that the earth, which had drunk the blood of his people, would never find peace. With every life disrespectfully taken, a scream would echo, an eternal lament. For the violence suffered, the generations that followed on the farm tried to ignore the warnings. The first settlers, driven by ambition, tried to extract wealth from the land. But each harvest was smaller. Each animal fell ill. The families who settled there were plagued by mysterious diseases, inexplicable misfortunes, and premature deaths. Children, in particular, were the most affected, succumbing to fevers and delirium, always hearing the scream that adults tried to suppress. The Fernandez, the family who sold the farm to Pedro, felt the weight of the curse the most. Their ancestors had been the cruelest in exploiting the land and torturing the last Kaiowás descendants. For decades, the family tried to prosper, but every endeavor failed. The cornfield, once bountiful, dried up before harvest. The cattle died of an unknown disease. The women of the family couldn't conceive or suffered miscarriages, and the few children born were weak and died young. Antonio Fernandez's grandmother, the last owner before Pedro, told chilling stories about the nights when the earth seemed to cry. She said that on the driest days, it was possible to see the spirits of the Kaiowás crawling in the cornfield, their eyes fixed on the house, demanding their revenge. The roots Pedro found were not merely vegetation. They were the physical manifestations of the pain, resentment, and curse that had rooted themselves in the very essence of that soil. They were the silent testimony of centuries of suffering and the constant reminder that the earth never forgets. The scream Pedro heard was not just a sound, but the lament of a violated land, an echo of the Kaiowás cries of pain and fury, warning that no one should ever dare to profane what was sacred. And so, the Fernandez farm became a tomb for hope, and a monument to terror, a place where the very earth screamed for justice. Pedro was never the same. The image of the twisted, bleeding roots in the soil and the guttural scream of the earth were seared into his mind like a branding iron. He fled the farm disoriented, driving for hours aimlessly, until exhaustion overcame him at an abandoned gas station. He slept there, in his car, waking in cold sweats, with the echo of the lament piercing his ears. He tried to start over. He sold what remained of his possessions, but the value of the cursed farm was null, a dead weight dragging him down. He moved to a small town in the interior, far from fields and farms, seeking refuge in anonymity and a simple routine. He got a job as a clerk in a hardware store, a job that required little interaction and allowed his mind to wander in its private. Hell, nights were a torment. The nightmares were vivid, repetitive. He'd see himself back in the cornfield, with the earth pulsating beneath his feet and the roots twisting, reaching for him. The smell of disturbed earth and old blood haunted him, even in broad daylight. In places with no scent at all, he distanced himself from people, fearing that the scream he constantly heard in his mind would be audible to others. His health began to decline. He lost weight. His eyes acquired a feverish glow, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. Insomnia was his constant companion, and when he finally managed to sleep, it was only to plunge into nightmares that left him more exhausted than before. Doctors found nothing physical, attributing his symptoms to severe post-traumatic stress. But Pedro knew it was more than that. It was the curse, an invisible shadow that followed him, binding him to the land he had tried and failed to tame. One afternoon, while arranging shelves in the store, he heard it. It wasn't the echo in his mind, but a real sound, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the floor. He stopped, his heart pounding. He looked around. No one else seemed to hear it, but the whisper intensified, transforming into a low, almost imperceptible lament, which Pedro recognized with icy terror. It was the scream. The cry of the cursed earth had found its way to him, crossing cities and states, to remind him of his inescapable connection to the horror he had witnessed. Pedro collapsed, kneeling on the store floor, his hands covering his ears, trying to muffle the sound only he could hear. That day marked the end of his attempt at normalcy. He knew that no matter where he went, the scream would follow him. The earth, wounded and vengeful, had marked Pedro as its own, and he was condemned to be a walking echo of his own suffering, forever trapped in the shadow of the farm he had tried, in vain, to call his own. Pedro, now wasting away, lived on the brink of sanity. The scream was no longer just an echo in his mind. He felt it in his bones, a constant tremor that prevented him from resting. The connection to the cursed farm, once incomprehensible, began to reveal itself through fragments of memories and sensations that were not his own. He saw flashes of virgin forests being felled, felt the terror of arrows hitting bodies, heard chants of lament in a language he didn't know. These visions and sensations came in waves, especially when Pedro was weakest or most disoriented. Hunger and exhaustion made him more susceptible, almost as if the curse took advantage of his vulnerability to manifest with greater force. He realized that somehow, by buying that land, he had inadvertently bound himself to its history, to the suffering of the Kaiowás, and to the fury of the very earth that had been desecrated. It was as if the farm, in its agony, had latched onto the first soul willing to make deep contact with it. Pedro was not just an observer. He had become a vessel for the ancestral pain of the place. He tried everything to rid himself of the torment. He sought spiritual help, from cleansing rituals to exorcism sessions, but nothing worked. The scream persisted, mocking his efforts. Desperate, he began to research local legends of the region, where the farm was located, consuming old books and articles about indigenous tribes and land curses. His obsession was unhealthy, but it was the only way he found to try to understand what was happening to him. He needed answers, even if they led him to madness. The research revealed that the Kaiowás curse was not just about vengeance, but about the earth remembering. It absorbed the pain, violence, and greed, and Pedro, by digging and touching the bleeding earth, had activated a point of resonance. He became the ear of the earth, the channel through which the lament of centuries could finally be expressed to the world. He was the forced voice of that cursed soil. The irony was cruel. Pedro, who sought a new beginning, became the guardian of a terrible past. His life was no longer his own. He was an echo of the cry of the cursed earth, condemned to carry the pain of a tragedy that predated his birth. Each day was a battle against madness, a gasp caught between reality and the personal hell the earth had created for him. And the scream, the scream, it would never be silenced.